The night my father looked me in the eyes in front of 50 people and said, "You are not my real daughter," and then pushed me to the floor, I finally understood something I had spent 32 years trying to deny. He had never been waiting for the right moment to love me. He had been waiting for the right moment to say what he had always believed. And that night at his own retirement party, surrounded by every person who had ever admired him, he finally did. Before we get into this, please take a moment to like and subscribe, but only if this story truly resonates with you. And drop your location and local time in the comments because I want to know where in the world this story is finding you tonight. My father's retirement party was supposed to be a celebration. 50 guests. Catered food. A slideshow of his life's greatest moments, none of which included me. And I stood in the corner of that banquet hall wearing the dress I'd saved 3 paychecks to buy, holding a card I'd spent 2 weeks writing. I had driven 6 hours to be there. 6 hours because even after everything I still believed that one day he would look at me and finally choose to be my father. And he didn't see me walk in. But I saw him, laughing with his colleagues, his arm around my half-sister, glowing like a man who had everything. And I walked toward him slowly, my heart hammering. "Dad," I said quietly. "I'm so proud of you," and the room didn't go silent. But he did. And he turned and looked at me the way you look at something you stepped in. Cold. Disgusted. Final. And then in front of every single person in that room he said the words he had been storing up for 32 years. "You are not my real daughter. You were never supposed to be here. Tonight or anywhere." And then he pushed me. Not a shove of frustration. A deliberate open palm push that sent me stumbling backward into a table. Glasses shattered. Heads turned. Someone gasped. And I hit the floor. And for a moment I just st. on the ground. In my 3-paycheck dress. Surrounded by strangers who watched and did nothing. And then my husband walked through that door. And he hadn't planned to come. He'd stayed behind to pack the car. But something told him to follow me inside, and he walked in just in time to watch his wife pick herself up off a banquet hall floor while her father straightened his tie. And he didn't yell. My husband is not a man who yells. And he crossed that room in 12 steps. I counted. He stood between me and my father, looked at him with the calmest, most terrifying eyes I have ever seen, and said, "You will never be in the same room as her again. Not at a funeral. Not at a wedding. Not in this life." And then he turned to the room, to the colleagues, the friends, the people who had watched and stayed silent, and said, "Anyone who saw what just happened and did nothing should think very carefully about what kind of person they are." And he took my hand. We left. And in the car I didn't cry right away. I just sat there still, holding the card I never gave him. The card that said, "Thank you for shaping me." And I realized, he had shaped me. He showed me exactly what a father must never be. And in doing so he sent me straight into the arms of a man who showed me what love actually looks like. My husband drove in silence for a long time. The kind of silence that isn't empty, it's full. Full of everything he was holding back so that I wouldn't have to hold anything at all. The streetlights passed over his face one by one, and I watched him the way you watch someone you suddenly love more than you ever knew you could. And I still had the card in my lap. And at some point somewhere on a dark highway between that banquet hall and the rest of my life, I rolled down the window and let it go. I watched it disappear into the night, and I felt something leave with it. Something I had been carrying since I was 5 years old, and first noticed that he held my half-sister's hand in parking lots but never mine. And that night my husband held me while I cried in a way I had never allowed myself to cry before. Not the quiet, controlled crying I had perfected over decades of disappointment, but the deep, ugly, gasping kind that comes from a wound that has finally been opened all the way so it can finally begin to close. He didn't tell me it was going to be okay. He didn't say anything at all. He just held on, and that was everything. And in the weeks that followed, something strange happened. People started reaching out. Not to defend him, but to confess. His colleagues who had stood in that room and watched. His friends who had heard what he said and done nothing. One by one, quietly, privately, they sent messages saying they were ashamed of themselves. That they didn't know what to do in the moment. That what they witnessed changed something in them. And his retirement party became the story people told in whispers. The night he showed every single person who admired him exactly who he was when he thought it didn't matter. And it mattered. And his reputation, the one he had spent decades carefully constructing, began to crack in places he couldn't see and couldn't control. I didn't do anything. I didn't make any calls or send any messages. I didn't have to. The truth has a way of traveling on its own, especially when 30 people witness it simultaneously. And my half-sister called me 3 weeks later. I almost didn't answer. When I did, she was crying before she even said hello. She told me she had confronted him after the party. That she had asked him how he could do that to me in front of everyone on a night that was supposed to be about family. She told me he didn't apologize. He justified. He explained. He reasoned. And in doing so, he lost her too. And she said I always knew something was wrong. I just didn't know he was the wrong thing, and that call broke something open in me, but gently this time. Because I realized I had spent my entire life believing I was the problem in that family. Too much, too sensitive, too present, too desperate for something he was never going to give. But the night he pushed me to the floor, he didn't reveal something about me. And he revealed everything about himself. And the most devastating revenge was simply this, that I got to leave. I got to walk out of that banquet hall, drive away into the dark, and wake up the next morning in a home where I was wanted, where my name was spoken with softness. Where my husband made coffee and brought it to me without being asked, and sat beside me in the morning quiet like someone who had chosen me specifically and deliberately every single day. And he never got to see what he lost. That's the thing about people who discard. Others, they don't grieve what they threw away, they move on, certain they were right, certain the loss was nothing. But I knew what I was worth now. Not because of anything he had given me, but because of everything he had taken and the fact that I had survived it. Every cold birthday, every holiday where I sat slightly outside the circle. Every moment I had twisted myself into a smaller, quieter, less inconvenient version of myself just to earn a fraction of his attention. And I had survived all of it. And I had arrived, whole, love, and finally free. Freedom, I learned, is not a single moment. It is not the car door closing behind you or the cart disappearing into the night wind. It is a slow daily process of unlearning. Of catching yourself waiting for a phone call that isn't coming and choosing consciously, deliberately not to wait anymore. Of waking up and realizing that the hollow place in your chest, the one you had carried so long you thought it was simply part of your anatomy, has started almost imperceptibly to fill. And I started therapy 3 months after the party. Not because I was broken, but because I finally believed I deserved to be put back together properly. My therapist was a small, sharp woman who had a way of asking questions that felt like she was handing you a flashlight in a room you'd been sitting in the dark for years. In our second session, she asked me when I first learned to make myself smaller. I opened my mouth to answer and couldn't speak for a full minute. Because the answer was, always. I had always been making myself smaller. Since before I had words for it. Since the very first time I noticed the difference in how he looked at me versus how he looked at her. And my therapist called it chronic grief. Grieving someone who is still alive. Grieving the father he never chose to be, over and over at every birthday, every graduation, every honorary Tuesday, when other daughters called their dads just to talk and I sat with my phone in my hand and didn't dial. And that kind of grief is exhausting in a way that's almost impossible to explain to someone who hasn't lived it. Because the world keeps expecting you to move on from someone who hasn't died. They say, he's still there, you could still fix it, family is family, blood is blood. But nobody tells you what to do when the blood in question looks at you like you are nothing. When the family in question has spent 3 decades making you feel like a guest in a house you were supposed to belong to. And I stopped explaining myself. There was another kind of freedom I hadn't anticipated. The freedom of no longer justifying my pain to people who needed it to be smaller so they could stay comfortable. I stopped shrinking my story to fit into conversations that weren't ready to hold it. I let it be as large and as heavy as it actually was. And strangely, the more space I gave it, the less it weighed. And my husband noticed the change before I did. He told me one evening quietly that I had stopped apologizing for things that weren't my fault. That I had stopped bracing that particular tension I used to carry in my shoulders like I was always preparing for something to be taken away. He said I looked like someone who had finally decided to stay in her own life. And I cried when he said that. The good kind of crying this time. And because he was right. For most of my life I had been half present in my own existence, one foot in the room, one foot hovering near the exit, always ready to disappear before someone could ask me to. Always anticipating the moment I would be told once again that I was too much or not enough or simply not real. And the night of that party when I hit that floor, something in me that had been waiting a very long time finally got its answer. Not the answer I had spent 32 years hoping for, but the true one. The one that set me free by destroying the last fragment of hope I had been quietly stubbornly protecting in some deep corner of myself. Hope is a beautiful thing. But false hope is a cage built from your own longing, and I had been living inside it my whole life. And what nobody tells you about finally letting go of a parent who never chose you is that the grief and the relief arrive at exactly the same time. They are not separate. They hold hands. You mourn the father you deserve and never had, and simultaneously you exhale, perhaps for the very first time, because the waiting is over. The audition is finished. You will never again stand in a banquet hall holding a card you wrote with shaking hands, hoping that this time, finally this time, he will look at you like you are his. And he won't. He never was going to. And knowing that, truly deeply in your bones knowing that, is the beginning of something that looks, if you are very brave and very patient, almost exactly like peace. Peace, I discovered, does not announce itself. It does not arrive with fanfare or clarity or a single crystallizing moment where everything suddenly makes sense. It seeps in slowly the way light comes through a curtain in the early morning, so gradually that you don't notice it until the room is already bright and you are already warm, and you realize with a kind of quiet astonishment that you have been okay for a while now without even knowing it. And it was a Saturday morning almost 8 months after the party when I noticed it properly for the first time. I was standing in my kitchen barefoot on the cold towel watching my husband flip pancakes badly, the way he always does, too impatient to wait for the right moment so they come out lopsided and slightly too dark on one side, and I was laughing. Really laughing. The kind that starts in your stomach and moves all the way through you. And somewhere in the middle of that laugh I realized I hadn't thought about him in 4 days. 4 entire days had passed and he had not occupied a single corner of my mind. And that had never happened before in my adult life. And I stood there in my kitchen with my laughing and my lopsided pancakes and my husband's sheepish grin, and I understood that this ordinary, imperfect, beautiful morning was what I had been starved of my entire childhood. Not grand gestures. Not dramatic declarations of love. Just a simple, steady experience of being in a room with someone who was genuinely glad you were there. And my mother called me that afternoon. She had known always that things were difficult between us. She had tried in her quiet and limited way to compensate, to be both parents at once, to fill a space that was never hers to fill. We had never spoken openly about it. There was an unspoken agreement between us to leave certain doors closed. But that afternoon something shifted. I think she had heard through the invisible network that connects all families, whether they like it or not, what had happened at that party. And she called not to discuss it but simply to say, I see you. I have always seen you. I am sorry it took the world so long to catch up. And we talked for 2 hours. It was the longest, most honest conversation we had ever had. She told me things about her own journey, her own silences, her own moments of failing to protect me when she should have stepped forward. She didn't make excuses. She just told the truth slowly and carefully, like someone dismantling something fragile. And I listened. And somewhere in that listening I felt another wall come down, one I hadn't even known I was maintaining. And forgiveness, my therapist had told me, is not a gift you give to the person who hurt you. It is a gift you give to yourself. It is the decision to stop letting their actions live rent-free in the center of your life. I had been resistant to that idea for months. It felt too generous. Too clean. Like it would somehow erase what had been done or suggest that it was acceptable or let someone off a hook they deserved to hang on permanently. But forgiving my mother was different. Because she had shown up. Imperfectly, belatedly, haltingly, but she had shown up. And showing up, I was learning, was everything. It was the entire thing. The people who showed up were the people worth keeping, regardless of blood, regardless of history, regardless of every complicated story in between. And I could not say the same for him. And I made peace with that distinction. And there is a particular kind of loneliness that comes from being the family member nobody fights for. I had known it my whole life, sitting at tables where I was tolerated but not treasured, attending events where my absence would have been more comfortable than my presence, existing in the peripheral vision of people who shared my last name but not my heart. I had mistaken that loneliness for a personal feeling. I had believed for 3 decades that if I were different, softer, easier, less needy, more impressive, the outcome would have been different too. But standing in my kitchen 8 months later, I understood something that I could not have been told and had to live my way into knowing. The loneliness was never about me. It was about him, his limitations, his cruelties, his inability to expand his heart beyond its own rigid, selfish boundaries. I was never too much. He was simply too small. And no amount of making myself smaller would have ever fit inside a space that was never built to hold me. And my husband came up behind me while I was lost in thought that afternoon, wrapped his arms around me from behind, rested his chin on my shoulder and said nothing. Just stood there with me, present and solid and real. And I thought about the word my father had used that night, real. You are not my real daughter. As if reality were something he had the authority to grant or revoke. As if love were a document that required his signature to be valid.